Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Beneath the Transaction podcast. I am here with Kate, and Kate is the Senior Director of Operations and Learning and Development.
Learning and development for operations,
There we
absolutely.
go. Learning and Development for Operations. All right. And this is a fun episode because it's our second time. This is our second go around. And the first one is lost somewhere in the cloud. We had a couple of episodes, unfortunately, that did not upload properly. And so here we are again. And I'm grateful for Kate and the others that have been willing to get on and have another discussion. I'm sad though, because Kate and I's conversation specifically was very good, and we shared some great stories together, very organic, and we had an amazing discussion that I think a lot of people could have benefited from. So we're not going to try to recreate that because that would be inauthentic. Rather, we were talking beforehand about what it was that we discussed and if there was some areas that we wanted to explore further. So that's what we're going to do today. And our point of our conversation, obviously, in this whole show is to have conversations that help us move beneath the transaction, understanding what others have done in their life or their leadership. It could be at home, at work, wherever, that have helped them do that. And I've been on this journey to have these conversations with people that I feel have something to say in that regard. And I've conducted research and spent my time doing this work, but I want to learn from others as much as I can. So that's the point of our show. And today, specifically, we want to talk about the moment that starts to catalyze transformation. I have this saying that transformation is caught, not taught. So you can't teach it. We talk about the 7 conditions of transformation a lot on the show. Those are the 7 conditions in my book. And the 7 conditions only came to fruition in our research once we were able to catalyze transformation. And I know that sounds really abstract, so we're going to put some texture to it today. But before I do, Kate, I'm going to turn it to you to give a more thorough introduction. Obviously, I shared your title. You can share the organization that you work for if you'd like, and what your background is. I know that you have spent a lot of time in training and development, and you have some amazing experience. And I think that's really what drew me to reaching out to you is you've been in this world of training people and teaching them, right? And that kind of is counterintuitive to my belief that you can't teach transformation. So even when we're tasked with teaching and training others, how do we help them catch it?
I think right there, so I don't lose the thread, Chris, is I agree. This idea of training and being effective. I'm sorry, I'm not a believer. I'm with you. There's so much more to it. And so after, my gosh, 20 plus years in training, development, and operations, I've got my start in aviation training. So I was FAA certified as a trainer in 9 and have conducted all kinds of safety, survival, evacuation, firefighting, and then leadership, hijacking, how to manage and comport yourself as a air crew, and then moved into some legal training, so legal compliance training. Unfortunately, after 20 years, the airline was bought by a holding company, and I reinvented myself. And so went into legal training, and then that ultimately got me into supply chain distribution. My first organization was with a drug distributor, and then I am now in food distribution for a very large organic and conventional food distributor. So I have a wonderful team of 10 of us trying to cover all of the US, Canada, everything in supply chain from safety and transportation to leadership and a little labor relations sprinkled in, you name it. That's what I do, but it's not who I am, and it's definitely not what I think creates effective leaders or transformational leaders by any means.
How would you answer who you are then?
I am a guide. I am someone who holds space for growth. I'm someone who focuses on potential, much more concerned with what can and could you do versus what did you do. It's just so basic. Not to be snarky about it, but like, okay, great, that's what you did. But how has that prepared you for what you're going to do? And more importantly, what motivates you? What do you want to do? What passion and talent do you have It's going to bring you and hopefully then others to a new state of being. That's what I care about.
Who are you becoming?
Who are you becoming? Yeah. And I think it's because we are, if you're living a conscious life, I think we're all looking for that answer. And so by asking me, who am I hope I'm a facilitator of that.
Yeah. Guide. I really love the word guide. When what's interesting about your background and anybody else that's in that industry, training and development, is there's always a lot of compliance. And having been in, like you said, in aviation world, legal world, and then, I spent some time in healthcare in a highly regulated industry of post-acute care. There's so much compliance, and it's very easy for that to become the sole focus of training and education, is to train people so that we're in compliance, so to speak. And it's important. So I'm by no means saying that it's not important, but compliance, I have never seen result in transformation. Compliance is transactional. It's so that we check all the boxes and we obviously we don't get hurt and we stay safe and all these things, which again are important, but they're very transactional. And so then the delivery of these things becomes transactional. The receiving of this training becomes transactional, and it kind of becomes a transactional enterprise. And so, I found ways to break through that a little bit when I was overseeing a couple of healthcare facilities and responsible for training and compliance. But how have you, in your journey, been able to see that it's only that it's compliance? And what have you done to either break through that, to make it more than that, or what else have you done on top of it to ensure that that's not the only thing that you're doing? Does that question make sense?
It does. It does very much. A few things, if I can keep them all present in the forefront of my mind here. First and foremost, I have really strong position on my perception of my audience, my class, those who I am training, is I truly believe and see them as gifts that have entered into this sort of shared space between us, this learning space. It's kind of a dojo, if you will, a space of growth and potential where we're not coming in on a top down. So first and foremost, I try to see anyone, whether they're on my team, whether they're my leader, whether they're people that we're going to explore a learning topic together, that they're seen as a gift. That's very key to me. There's a very old saying, I'm sure you've heard it: when the student is ready, the master appears. And in my opinion and my experience as a trainer, it's actually the opposite. When the master is ready, the student appears. Because we learn so much more from those that we help to guide and facilitate through their lives than we could ever absorb through a book, through our own experiences. It's this constant reflection and feedback from others. And so if we continue to see that relationship as a gift, then it's that shared experience that creates a cycle that is then founded in an ideal higher than the compliance. I see you as a person, so your safety matters more to me. I see you as another living, talented entity, so your success matters to me more than whether or not you check that KPI. The other piece of that is a concept I think we've explored before that I talk a great deal about, especially with folks that I am more in like a train the trainer relationship. So developing others to become facilitators is a concept I call suspension of the ego. A temporary, I can't get rid of it. She's always going to be there. But how can I temporarily suspend the needs of myself, the goals for myself, so that the learner is the goal? The learner's learning for that period of time supersedes any need for me to stand up there and list my qualifications or to tell stories about my own wounding or journey, unless, of course, it's germane to the development that I'm hoping to achieve. I'm more than happy to share my own pitfalls so that others don't have to step in the same pit. But taking the self out and seeing that individual and their potential is what I think grounds the why. So to go back to your question on the compliance training, how do you exceed just checking the box, is connecting with the person on a fundamental level.
Yeah, I remember our conversation about suspending the ego, and there's a lot of depth there. You know, we're like-minded in this way, so I'm gonna lay something out not because I think you need to hear it. It's more because I think there's a lot of people in your position or leaders in organizations that see training and development this way that I'm about to explain. And I love what you're talking about because you only learn that through experience and time. And if we can learn it from others before we have to go through it ourselves and the suffering ourselves, the better. But I think a lot of people see training and development again, not just as compliance, but it's checking a box, and there is a lot of ego. Usually individuals that are tasked with training. Now I'll use healthcare for example because I was in healthcare. You know, there's usually a nurse that oversees a lot of staff development. And you have to get all the staff, a lot of your CNAs, nurses, you know, LPNs, and even your housekeepers and what have you. You know, they have to pass all these certain tests, so to speak. That's the best way to put it. And in service and all of these things. And the person in charge of it is usually well versed and well experienced. They've been doing it a long time. So they're the expert, right? And so it's really easy for them to see others as not as smart, right? They don't know as much. And so the ego can really get in the way there. And it's all about compliance. And if you don't do it in healthcare, I'll tell you, one of my first experiences leading in healthcare, a lot of experience leading before, but now I'm thrown into healthcare in this highly regulated environment. And I'm sitting in a building in Arizona because their CEO was gone. So I was kind of covering. And that week they had to terminate a therapist. And I was, you know, in this meeting and the second in command, sort of the chief nursing officer was the one running the conversation. But I was sitting in there and I was mostly observing, you know, and I don't want to speak illy of anybody that was in the room, but I was really sort of disgusted with how the process went. This therapist who meant well and you know had a good intent and was trying to do their job well, wasn't in compliance, went outside of their scope. Now in the medical field, you cannot go outside of your scope, right? Like I am not a CNA, for example, so I can't even, if somebody fell on the ground, like one of our patients, I could not help them up because I'm not certified to do it, right? And if you go outside of that scope, it could be cause for termination. So I'm sitting in this termination and this therapist went outside of her scope a couple of times. And if it was outside of this facility, you and I would look at this situation and be like, that is so silly. She was just trying to help, right? But she went outside of her scope and there's compliance and there's regulations. So it was this big deal. And she's sitting in the corner in tears and they're terminating her. And it was so transactional. And so there was no empathy. There was no humanness in this. And I was disgusted. And I wasn't even disgusted with the people. I was honestly disgusted with the industry that we have to have these conversations with good people and they have to be terminated for just trying to be helpful. That's not okay. Now I can't change the whole industry, right? Because it's regulated by the government, right? And so I can't change that, but the way that we address those things and the way that we handle those things, I think make all the difference. And I vowed to myself right then and there, I'm like, I will never do this. You know, I'm going to make sure that there's going to be another way and I'm going to try every way possible before I have to result in this conversation. And it's certainly not going to be had this way. Like, well, you weren't in compliance, so we got to fire you. Like that, it's just, I didn't sit well with me. So sorry for that tangent, but I think a lot of us see, and everybody in the room, by the way, a lot of experience. We're talking decades of experience in the room. So these people have been leading for a long time. So it's not like they were new to the job, but we become so transactional. We see training simply as compliance. They got to check the boxes. Otherwise, someone gets in trouble, someone gets hurt, this, that. And that's true. But that it becomes just that. And so then ego gets in the way and process gets in the way and time goes by and we've created a pretty transactional organization. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. I feel like as leaders and as people responsible for training and developing people, training is something that must be done, but developing should be the key. We're developing people. It's like we need to stop training people and develop them and build them. And I love what you said about the ego because I think that is one of the first things that gets in the way. And it can get in the way of, well, if they don't get these things, they're going to make me look bad. Like the story you shared with me, and maybe you'll touch on it again. You know, when you were first training all of these new, did you call them cadets or new um,
Flight attendants. They were flight attendants.
flight attendants. When you're training all of them and you did a great job, you did everything you're supposed to do, but then at the end you got some bad feedback, and that really impacted you. How do we break out of that and see that our role is not just to pass on information that,
Yeah.
again, because it's easy to think, well, if they mess up, then that's going to come back on me and they're going to say I didn't do a good job training them. So we have all these
Yeah.
things that encourage our ego. And I think I shared this with you last time, that we can live life in two ways. And one of my mentors told me this. We can live life in a way where we're always defending threats to our ego, to our self-image of ourself, or we're looking for reinforcements of it. So we're either looking for reinforcements of our self-image, or we're defending threats to it. That's one way to live life. The second way is to just forget about that and get lost in the needs around us. That's so much easier said than done, but anybody that's training and responsible for it, any leader, it can be so easy to see people that we're responsible for building and developing as actual vehicles to our own image of looking good for others, doing our job. So suspending the ego is such an important thing. With everything that I just shared, I want to hear some of your response to it, because I think we can easily see training as compliance, and that's all it is. And it creates pretty transactional organizations.
Well, I'll comment back on your mentor. You said, there's these, we're either looking for validation or we're looking for the threat to defend. That's one way to go through life. And the other one being, we set all of that aside and we care about what's going on around us. And it is, to me, that's the difference between becoming a leader and being a wise leader. That ability to reflect back on the value add. Is there any value in being defensive? No, we know we're going to get attacked. We know people are going to want to. Growth is scary. Growth hurts. So, as a leader, as a guide, you know that at times it's probably going to get kicked back on you. And I would also say we're not perfect. So, of course, there's going to be opportunity to find areas where I've failed and fallen short. The other idea of looking for validation, to me, rings equally hollow because that's also temporary. That's coming externally. That the validation that I need as myself today is, did I do the best job I could for that person and that moment in time today? That matters more to me than internal or external validation or keeping things at bay. And I think the story that really exemplifies that, as you recalled so well, is the state that I was in when I first started training. We didn't have a lot of structure or leadership to how it went about. We were Teamsters. So there was just a group of us who trained each other. And we got a manager of training. It was a big deal. We have a leader. She's still one of my dearest friends today. She changed my life, the course of my career, because she implemented a feedback form. So I'd been training for probably 4 or 5 years and had never heard feedback on my own self. And so the first stack of papers came in, because of course it was all on paper back then. And, it was, is she fair? Yes. Does she know her stuff? Yes. Did I learn? Am I going to be a safe flight attendant out there? Yes. Do I want to be in her class? No. She's unapproachable. She's I don't know if I can use the word on your podcast, but the big B, like you name it. It was like, wow, she's not a nice person. And that was just unbelievably soul rocking. And it was because it was so out of alignment with my self-perception and the value that I thought I was providing to those people that were learning. And what I found out was that they cared, just like what you're proposing, they cared about what's beneath that transaction. That's what they wanted to know. Did I want them to succeed? Did I want to have a relationship with them? Did I want to know them as people? That mattered far more whether or not you can use a Halon 1211 fire extinguisher at a ballast fire or something like that. That was immaterial. So finding that truth reflected into myself, my ego told me that my ego wasn't serving me, that I wasn't being led from the right place. And so going inside and really examining that, I'll never forget it. Brenda, I said to my new supervisor, my manager, I said, "And what do I do? Tell me what to do. Tell me how to change this." And she said, "I don't know, but I know you well enough to know that if there's anyone who can figure it out, it would be you." Because she knew me before. She knew me from flying the line together, big long trips in Japan, things like that. So it was tough. It was several weeks of really deep introspection. And I got my next class about 2, 3 weeks later. And back then, classes were 6 weeks long, 6 days a week. You were with me from about 7 in the morning till 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. I had myself and one other team teacher to kind of keep your lungs from drying out from talking that much. And when I introduced myself to that class, I took what at the time was a terrifying leap of faith,
Hmm.
a true existential leap
Yeah.
into an unknown, which for me was articulating my name, my title, and then I care about your success in this class.
Yeah.
I had never said I care out loud.
Yeah. Well, the change, this is kind of the direction we're going is the change started with you long before you actually stood in front of that group the second time. It started when you got that feedback and when your mentor gave you, you know, an additional few words of feedback. You started to suspend the ego before you were ever in front of another group training them. And I think that's key. When you work with your team now and the trainer model, like you're working with and training those that are going to go out and train others, is suspending the ego isn't when you turn the slide deck on and you start clicking through it starts long before. And that's a choice to make, and that also requires a lot of introspection, a lot of self-reflection, examining our life in such a way where we start to identify, why do I have an ego in these areas? Why do I feel the need to defend these threats right now? What image do I have of myself? What self-talk do I have? How do I see myself and think about myself that's causing me to be defensive right now? Much like, I don't know if you had this conversation with yourself in that moment, but when you got that feedback, what was it threatening in you, right? Like there was something even when you got that feedback, like, oh, man, they didn't like me. Everything else was good, but they didn't like me. We have these images we carry around and we're defending threats or we're looking for reinforcement. And had you not read that piece and you just read the top ones, those probably would have fed the ego a little bit, like, yeah, I know my stuff. I'm good, like, and so it's just, if we could put those lenses on, we'll see how often we're looking for validation or defending threats. And I could also say a leader could listen to that story. A transactional leader would say, well, who cares, Kate? You did your job. They all know their stuff. They're in compliance. They know what to do. So who cares if they don't like you? Great.
Absolutely.
Who cares? And I think a transactional leader would see it that way. And if they're listening right now, they'd be like, I don't see what the problem is. Like, we got them to do everything we needed to do. But like you
But did
said, what
you?
they're going to
But did you?
Exactly. We don't know. And it would be what an interesting study, because I'm a researcher and a nerd, to see what would be the difference. Everybody learned the technical skills. They can pass the test, check all the boxes, put them out into the workforce. One had an experience like those first folks where they just didn't like the trainer. It didn't feel good. And then the next, maybe the second version of you where they felt like they mattered. What employee goes off long term and has a better impact in the organization? And what
And
moves
we
you
have
don't.
data on that. The turnover, right? The camaraderie, the ability to function as a high performing team, all of those things is tenfold over a transactional training experience. So in my current life, our supply chain distribution, resource scarce, everything is do more with less. Who isn't doing that anymore? But it's very, on a 2% margin, there's not a lot of wiggle room there. And so how do we thread in enough of that human element so that when we're targeting KPIs or processes or system functionality, how can we bring that thread through and weaving in the leadership piece? Because in a high labor market, and which is what I'm in, it takes people to move boxes through a building. I can't just talk about the box on the forklift. Someone's driving that forklift. Someone's leading that driver. And so in my experience, it does play out. Your ROI on people if you want to measure it that way. I do not personally. I do if I if I have to. Proof is there. If you have a team that has come together under ideals that are extracurricular, if you will, something that supersedes the KPI and the metric, when things go wrong, as they will, who's going to be there by your side saying, "We got this. We're going to work through this. You're not going to fail"? That's an ROI you can't put money on.
Who we are in relation to others, how we see ourselves in relation to others, I think is one of the most important things that we can do to catalyze transformation, because it's not who are others in relation to me, it's who am I in relation to them? How do I see myself in relation to other people? That's so important because the second time in your story, what you did was you actually were very intentional and formal in letting people know where you stand in relation to them. And you said it with your words, and then the rest of the day or time that you spent with them, now it's going to be deployed behind your intent and your actions and all the conversations and everything after that. But setting the tone and creating ritual, so to speak, of placing how you see yourselves in relation to them is so important. And this is why, one of the key themes throughout my book and the work that I do is a lot of indigenous wisdom, because those cultures have taught me so much, and my very own cultures from my ancestors have taught me so much. And they've taught me so much because they're intentional about these things. And we're talking thousands of years ago. They weren't running, multiple multi-million dollar companies. They were trying to survive, and they created cultures that have withstood the test of time, and some of them even colonization, but they were intentional about the things that really mattered.
Yeah.
Like they have to survive, and these cultures had very sophisticated ways of surviving. For example, in Hawaii, if you look at an island, indigenously, there's words for this in Hawaiian that I'm not going to try to attempt to say, but they would divide their land up kind of like a pizza, if you will, middle of the island, and like a pie. And they would, that's how the land would be divided. And then within each of those sections, from the top all the way to the bottom, so basically the mountains all the way down to the sea, everyone had different responsibilities in that section. If you were up higher, timber and building, and then you go farther down to farming, all the way down to the ocean, it's fishing, and everybody had a responsibility. They all had a part to play. And you can bet that they wouldn't call it compliance, but there was like, hey, look, you got to do this and I got to do that, and we got to make it function. So that was important to their survival. But the things that have withstood the test of time were how they related to one another, and how they referred it to each other. I mean, the spirit of aloha, right? Like, we share the breath together is essentially a really bad translation of what it means. I share my breath with you. We share which is breath, right? We share the breath of life with one another. And how they greeted each other, from the gesture that I've talked to you about, that's in the book too, of placing your forehead, your nose to the other, and taking a deep intentional breath upon greeting them. That's grounding in this idea that I am in relation to you and we are the same. And, in the Philippines, there's this term called kapwa, Kapwa. It still exists today. And it's this idea that in English, the translation is basically, I am who I'm in relation to. So there's this fundamental belief that still exists today, that I am no more important than you, and you are needed for me to be, and I am needed for you to be. We cannot be without each other. And so there's words and there's gestures to illustrate how important it is that we are in relation to each other, and that we see and care for one another in a certain way before we start our work. And I feel like we miss that a lot in Western culture, and we have to find creative ways to do it, because we don't have 1,000-year-old rituals or customs or gestures to help us do it. But great leaders find ways to do it. They find ways to do that. And you found a way, and I'm sure you've gotten better and better at this since that day, but you found a way to do it when you started that training to relate. Hey, this is how I am in relation to you guys, and that's what's most important to me. And I'm sure, again, you've gotten better at finding ways to do that throughout time. But it's critical. Like, 100 years from now, what are people going to think about our organization's culture, if it even lasts that long, right? Can it even last that long? I don't know. But if it were to, what would they say about it? Is it just, here's the things they did, or would they feel and say things that had more depth to it? that this is how I felt and this is what mattered to them. So what else have you done as you've gone along the way? You're not maybe not seeing it the same way I am, as like I got to make sure that I'm being intentional in how I see myself in relation to others. You talked about suspending the ego. What else, what other things have you sort of ritualized, I guess, in
Right.
your work to help make that possible?
Well, a couple of things coming to mind for sure. So at this stage of my career, that story is obviously very, very early on. But at this stage in my career, I'm at the bottom end of this cycle, if you will. So the cycle being awareness of the self, awareness of how you're being perceived, choosing to suspend that or to release that for purpose, and then coming around and seeing that as wisdom. I'm now back at the bottom of that cycle, but now in a very intentional choice of when do I embody that authority? When do I embody that wisdom? Not because I'm going to come in top down and directive, authoritarian, but owning that wisdom enough so that it is modeled and through a multi-tiered report structure, right? And so it is, for the most part, and of course everybody's a work in progress, for the most part, it works pretty well. But when folks want us to, as leaders and as higher level leaders, want us to stay in a area of extreme permission in the cycle, it can be jarring for them if we move too quickly in and out of that sort of little bit wiser, a little bit more confident, a little bit more assured, like, no, I do know what I'm talking about, and this is how I'd like to go about it. But what leads to the answer to your question is, how am I now playing in that space, and how do I approach that with new and fresh approaches, is a more extreme removal of myself than ever before. And what I mean by that is, as I get through to the top of that leadership cycle again, and I'm embracing my confidence and my wisdom, my experience, I will remove completely so that that person has that full space to explore whether or not they're finding success. Is this really what you wanted the outcome to be? I'm out of this. I'm removed. And now this is either accurate or beautiful or wonderful presentation, or did you do your research? Where's the meat and potatoes to this? Is this just another fluff piece? Right? So guiding becomes even less direct and more of that opening space. And so I think we talked a little bit about this before, that I feel that this playground, so many different words for it. In my mind, this is going to be hokey, but it does look like a jetway boarding an airplane to me, where I am extending the jet bridge. You can choose to stay in the airport. You can choose to only get on the jet bridge and not stepping on that airplane. Or you can take the steps onto the airplane. I'm not flying the plane. I don't even know if the plane's going to go anywhere. It may not even push back from the gate. But you are welcome. You are in a shared space to sit down. I'll give you a glass of champagne. I'll get you a pillow and a blanket. Maybe even give you a seatbelt so you're a little bit more secure.
Yeah.
But that's all your choice. It's that person, that learner's decision. And the more I can be simply the facilitator, the host, the guide of that, the more potential that person has for growth and learning of their self.
Yeah. This reminds me, I think being that, especially in positions of leadership, is so critical, right? Being that for people in general in life, for our loved ones and people that we care about is critical. But sometimes we feel like when we get into the organizational space, something needs to be systematized. It needs to be, more formal. And there's a lot of truth to that. The home life or personal life has a little bit more ebb and flow, and there's not as many deadlines and like you said, KPIs and things that were metrics we're measuring and what have you. But that being that space is so important. And you reminded me, when I was in healthcare for a little bit, the first building that I was leading, all the department heads, there was a lot of, we'll call silos that was there. People didn't really trust each other. Culture was pretty toxic when I got there. And so one of my first priorities was we got to fix this culture, right? And again, we're in an industry that's very highly regulated, and there's a lot of everything's about meetings and process and this and that. Some of those things were falling apart, but I had to figure out a way to systematically help create this space for people, especially the department heads, and build their trust. So it wasn't just one conversation I had with them at the beginning of, hey, what could I do to be helpful, and what do you think should change here? I mean, anybody can do that, but what you do consistently over time is what really matters. And I wish I had more time there, to see how this could have panned out over more months and years. But I implemented this thing I learned many years ago. We call them SAMs, self accountability reports. And with all the department heads, over food service, housekeeping, laundry, maintenance, our nursing department, therapy department, you name it, I said, look, I want to create a space where accountability is fostered and not me holding people accountable, right? Like the true metric of accountability is you don't have to hold people accountable. They just hold themselves accountable. Like that's the true, that's perfect right there in terms of accountability, perfection. If everybody feels like they're taking ownership of how they can change, you have a pretty accountable organization. So we implemented this thing called SAMs, and it was really simple. This is my job, and I would just say narrow it down to four main roles. Like, what are your four main roles in your work? And underneath those roles, you can list out your different activities or tasks that you have. But what are the four main things that you're supposed to do as the chief nursing officer, as the director of dietary, whatever it is? And so they do that. And then I said, look, once you list those things out, I want you to rate yourself. And we had this rating system of how they would rate themselves in each of those areas. And you're rating yourself. Like, I'm not rating you, you're rating yourself. And then your job is to meet with me at whatever cadence you think is necessary. I said, I recommend a month. Let's meet monthly. But I'm not scheduling this. You are. And I'm not leading that meeting. You are. And you're going to send that to me, and you're going to come and meet with me and tell me about how you feel you're doing in your work. And we're going to have this conversation. And it's different than other accountability conversations because I didn't schedule it, they did, and I'm not leading it, they are. And they've already held themselves accountable before even coming to me. They've found a way to rate how they're doing in their role. And then my job is to simply listen and provide thought and insight. And then my job as the leader is to report down to them in essence. Here's what I could do to be more helpful to you. I see why you rated yourself lower here, and I actually feel like I probably could do something more helpful for you. And then the whole conversation becomes about becoming in progress rather than, hey, make sure you do this and this and this and this. And the feeling is different. And that started to change things. Just the intent of it and the practice of it started to flip how people saw the hierarchy, and that was a way that we figured out how to sort of systematize creating this environment and this space where people can grow, and to the point that we wanted to get with our conversation of where they can be the first to change, because it's so much different when we change first versus somebody compelling us to change. It changes everything. And in fact, I would say that's actually the catalyst to transformation, is how can I be the first to change and then actually doing it. I
Mhm.
think that's what catalyzes transformation every time. But so long as we're resistant to change and resistant to feedback and resistant to the thinking of me first, and it's easier to point fingers at others, I think we just drastically limit the ability for transformation to ever occur. That goes for our relationships and our organizations. So sorry again for my other tangent. I just love all these things you're sharing, and it makes me think of all these other stories. And I think you've figured a lot of things out, and you wouldn't say that you're perfect, but you figured a lot of great things out over the years. And I think it's because you've been seeking it. You've been seeking, there's a better way to do this. What's next on your becoming list, and what are you trying to figure out now that you're wrestling with?
So to go to your story, what I love about your SAM implementation is it is a way to um, systematize you going first. What barriers can I remove? What can I do to exemplify that I hold myself accountable, that I want to see you successful? And so you created a very visible loop for that. I have a similar mechanism. It's not nearly as graceful or eloquent, and so I may steal just a tad bit
Go ahead.
shamelessly there. I think it's wonderful. When my teams and I get together, it's always the last question is, what do you need? What can I do? What else can how can I help? There's not a single person, whether they are my leader or my peer or my report, my customer. What can I enable to free you to success? So I love that. That's beautifully eloquent. Well, and to answer your second part of the question, this cycle that I'm talking about is, of course, also currently, as far as I know, time bound in this plane. And so it's cycling as I progress through time and the milestones that go with that. So being a wife, being a mother, being a team leader is cyclical. And my human here is about to graduate from high school and go off to college. And that's a new becoming, a new stage of my life cycle. And so I feel a tremendous purpose in the experiences that I've had. And maybe, Freudian or someone would maybe say that I am using past experiences or wounds to try to heal or justify my current state. That's awfully transactional. I don't buy it. I see great purpose to it. And the question of how can we continue as, co-facilitators of life, co-guides, tour guides, what have you, becomes paramount. And especially as I'm looking at the last 15 years of formal work ahead of me, do I take that to a third world experience or a developing world experience? Do I continue to work within the sphere that I've been given? And so to go back to a little bit of those founding wisdoms, this is my father's great words of wisdom. When I became a flight attendant, I went to undergrad and everybody said, what do you want to do with this? You're a philosophy major. Not going to get a job. There are no ads in the newspaper for philosophers. And I said, I don't care so long as I see the world. And that was my goal. It was more of a idea versus a destination. And so I became a flight attendant, and at 25, I put this in quotes. I went to my father and said I had realized my life's dream at 25 because I had been to every continent. And I was at this crisis of what am I going to do? And we walked through all of these different scenarios. Well, you could join the Air Force and you could become an officer and, join a think tank, get your PhD. Well, what am I going to do, Dad? And my dad, who is a huge part of enabling and illuminating this path to change for me, said, Kate, you're always looking for this next big thing, on the horizon, and you want to turn the corner and it's going to be big and dramatic, and you're more than willing and capable of that jump, that leap. Very adventurous. I'm fairly fearless. He says, but the key to success, the longer we live, is not the big moves. It's how do you learn from and capitalize on what you've already accomplished? And that was a huge paradigm shift for me at 25. Go from airplanes and military bases and one thing after another. I flew for the DoD to, well, what have I done?
Hmm.
Going down to my airline's headquarters and saying, I don't know what I'm really asking for here, but if you need extra help, if you need someone to do things around the office, I'm good at writing, that kind of thing. Like I wasn't really sure what I was saying at 25. And they said, sure, we could always use the extra help. And so that concentric little pond circle continued to grow to now where I am just profoundly honored that I've trained and worked with more people than I could ever remember their names. I may have even forgotten their faces, and yet have had the opportunity to pass through these people's lives and hopefully been a positive wave of interaction. So where that next circle goes, where do I take this from here? Where does anybody take this from here?
Yeah.
Um, it's a wonderful, beautiful question that doesn't have a very clear answer sometimes for me.
Yeah. Well, the story is still being written, so to speak. And To close, something that you reminded me of as you were sharing, because you're so right, but you reminded me of two things. One of the chapters of the book on purpose, it's really written invitationally, and it's not just a chapter on purpose. And this is what purpose is. The chapter is called "You Came from Something, Now Become Something." And one of the indigenous terms from the Philippines, it's indigenous, but it's still a word that's used today, that's really stuck with me since I learned it, is this word called pamana. Pamana, pamana. And it essentially means your lineage, where you come from. And that's really everything in a lot of island culture, is where you come from. Some island nations they can say generations back who they come from, and that's actually how they introduce themselves. I am not Chris. I'm Chris, son of Senen and Barbara. Senen, my dad's name. He's son of Nelia, and you can go on and on and on. And that's how they introduce themselves, because where they come from is so important to their identity. But I've learned to really appreciate pamana as this idea of this sort of, we're a link in a chain.
Yeah.
And there's generations before us, and there's going to be generations after us. And on my dad's side, my mom's side, the Anglo side, I mean, family history is decades and centuries back. Trace it back hundreds and hundreds of years. My dad's side, because of colonization and many other things, I can only trace back a few generations. And I've been determined to make a life that has two really important priorities that are overarching to lots of the others. One is to come to know who those people were and honor them, right? Whether I learn their names or not, who those people are that came before me, because I am now because of them. And the second is to make sure that my posterity, those that come after me, my kids, my grandkids, my great grandkids, and those that will actually never know who I am, will actually know who I am. And they may never have met me. They may not know all the details of my life, but they'll know who I was. And I want to live a life where that time that I have, the link that I am in a long chain, that it matters. And you reminded me of that when you were just talking, right? The decisions that we make every day and the things that we go through, and more importantly, what we learn from them, and then what we decide to do after, really changes not just us, but many generations to come. And when we're all made up of many people before us and many people after us. And I think that big picture of how we see the world and how we see what we do changes how we choose today, and changes who we choose to become right now. So I love that you are letting that journey unfold, and the little that I have learned about you, to the ability to reflect upon the past and learn from those moments and actually implement those things actively into your life. I think those are amazing qualities that you can't force, and you can't just teach, and you can't make up. They're qualities that make a powerful influence on others. And that's what catalyzes transformation. So with all that, the last question is always, what's the takeaway that you want to leave with others that maybe you're feeling yourself after this conversation?
Mhm, mhm. And my family too is severed from its past. My ancestors, my grandmother came to this country from Russia during the Tsarist revolution, and they were czarists and came to the US, and we were told, don't ask about the old country. We left it. We came here to give you a new start. We don't talk about it. And so I I am very curious on what is that's behind there that exists. And perhaps that has been part of the fuel, the jet fuel to my here, is seeking that identity, seeking understanding, seeking other. What is that other knowledge? What is that other way that we can be? And we all are raised with good times and bad, and putting that, contextualizing that into our ancestors, into a global consciousness, into a experience where we can create community and create growth. It fuels the purpose for me.
Yeah. Kate, thank you. I think this all kind of led to the overarching theme of, to catalyze transformation is creating change first in our own life. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that. And that could be, like we've just recently been talking about, being more aware of where we came from, where we're going. Those sort of questions, I think, impact what we choose today, and how we choose today is going to catalyze whether we start the journey of transformation or not. And I've learned over the years that transformation is not an abstract journey. It's a very real journey that we can be on, that changes how we feel and see ourselves and those around us and our circumstances at the end of the day. So I'm grateful for you joining the show and doing another recording. Appreciate all that you've done to contribute to our conversation, but just want to formally thank you and thank all the listeners that have tuned into this episode as well.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in today. And until next time, everybody, take care.